After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop e5, the Rossolimo is on the board. In this video, we're going to start a chapter on g6, which is the main move the black plays against this opening. So white now goes on with castling, and after bishop to g7, we take the knight. We have to take this chance now because black might have played knight e5. We wouldn't have been able to swap the bishop for the knight and damage the pawn structure of our opponent, which is the whole point of the Rossolimo players. And knight e5 was going to be protected by the bishop, and also the knight in e5 would have wanted to trade with our very important knight in f3. So this is the moment to capture the knight, and there's two ways to take back, either b or d. Let's start with centralizing the pawn and allowing the development of the bishop through the a6 diagonal, which is thematic. Anyway, white goes on with rook e1. This is the best place to put the rook, and now let's look at a few options. So there's plenty of options we're going to go through. Let's start from knight f6, for example, one of the most popular. Now here we attack the knight immediately, e5, and the knight's going to have to move. So obviously going back would make no sense, so we're going to go through the main move, the only move basically that makes sense, which is knight d5. Here we attack the knight again, c4, and either way now white already has a lead. Not that big, but he has a lead. So after c4, the knight, we're going to go through three different moves. Let's start from, for example, knight b6, putting pressure on the square, c4. White now goes on with d4, ignoring the pawn in c4. And now white has a threat of playing pawn takes c5. Remember, the black player can never support the square in c5, the pawn in c5 with d6. The game really doesn't look good after d6 because you can still take in c5, and when the pawn takes back, you can swap queens. So for example, queen takes, king takes, and now b3 to protect the pawn. This is all safe, this diagonal is not vulnerable. And now, well, black has to move. There's no point in going through this line because basically black has got this double isolated pawn on the c file. This knight is really silly. And there's no way that the knight can actually get to play because even knight d7 it really does nothing because you're going to be putting pressure on this pawn, but it's very well defended and bishop b2 is coming. Let's say, for example, bishop to g4. A few ideas would be like here, we don't want to allow this doubling up of the f pawn. Also, our knight in f3 is super strong because he has an idea of jumping to g5 and then e4. We don't want to give that up. Threatening a fork, so after king moves, bishop to b2. And after rook to d8, stopping our knight from developing to d2, where we might have had some good ideas like e4 and c5. Still, knight to e4 attacks this double weak pawn. Positions, it's not like white is completely winning, but it's like around +2. And there's nothing to do to protect it. So for example, knight to d7 loses to knight f6 check, winning a bishop in g4. This cannot really be taken back because if black takes with a knight, then you can take back and you have an attack on the bishop. The pawn in e7 is pinned. So for example, the bishop can't take in f6 because bishop takes for free, and even bishop retreating to f8 is a bit of a joke because you can take the pawn in e7, you've got an attack on h8 with the bishop. And here, after the check, if pawn takes, well then check, and it's a discovered attack. The best move will be, well, obviously moving the king is wrong because pawn takes and there's going to be a fork. It's even worse. But there's nothing here. Bishop moves, but then you can take the bishop, rook to g8, and after knight to d2. We're equal in material if you think about it. Well, white is up a pawn, but this g7 pawn, black can never attack it with the light square bishop, for example. Is going to have to use a knight to attack it unless black wants to give up the exchange. Position is evaluated around +4 or +5. Besides, there's this permanent weakness. So let's move on to the other line. Let's recap actually. Knight f3, knight c6, Rossolimo. Okay, we're going through g6. Castle, bishop g7, now we have to take the knight, and we're looking at b takes. Rook e1, knight f6, we attack the knight immediately. Knight moves, we attack the knight again. Knight b6, and now we play d4. So as mentioned, d6 cannot be played. You might argue, okay, pawn takes d4, typical idea of the Sicilian player, or what happens if knight takes the free pawn in c4? Well, taking the pawn in c4 gives a scenario that is very similar to earlier with an extra theme. Pawn takes in c5 now, that was the idea mentioned before. White owns the center completely. How is it possible that the position is already evaluated like white has a good advantage? Well, because this knight here is never going to go anywhere. All of these squares are attacked by white pieces or pawns, except this one. So what's going to happen now is, well, white is threatening queen to c2, attacking the knight, forcing the knight to go to a5, and from there the knight will never play unless it wants to go to b7 afterwards. But think about it, queen c2, knight here, and then if later the knight wants to try and join the game, knight b7, maybe attacking this pawn. This pawn is defended. It's defendable in multiple ways as well. And also this will be depriving the bishop the capacity to move, because d6 to develop the light square bishop can never be played since we have a very well placed rook and would just be able to win material. You might argue that black will just castle at some point, but bishop g5 is a very strong positional move. So we're gonna get to that line in a second, because we're about to say something very similar and we'll take it from there. In this position, after d4, black shouldn't take this pawn. It's a completely useless material capture, because black might think, okay, my opponent is not going to give me the d pawn for the c pawn, but yes, we are going to do it. We're going to get crucial control over d6, and black will have a useless piece, the knight. He will not be able to use it, and not even have a good way to develop the light square bishop. So let's go through the proper move. C takes d4. Now white continues with c5, once again attacking the knight. And knight, we're going to look very quickly at two options: knight back to c4 or knight to d5. There's nowhere else to go anyway. a4 is attacked by queen, and every other square is occupied by black piece. So knight c4 gives a very similar scenario that I mentioned a few seconds ago to earlier. So I'm about to show how useless black pieces become when black moves the knight to the wrong square. So b3, attacking the knight, and after an only move, knight to a5, queen takes back. The development of the white player is excellent. So let's go on a few normal moves. Castle, knight c3, all of these moves are going to happen. There's no threat that black can possibly try. Let's look at d6, for example. Black will have to develop the pieces. Think about it. The rook has no future. Black cannot push the a pawn in an attempt of playing a4 later on. Rook b8 is completely pointless. It does nothing. This is a very safe pawn chain. Black will have to try and get some space for his pieces. A move like f6 would be bad, because you just develop the bishop in f4. You got nothing to fear. This diagonal, these dark squares are just completely controlled by white pieces. Taking in order to develop the rook is just pointless. Bishop takes back. Black is actually just helping white to find even more space for attacks. Position is evaluated like white was up piece. So in this position, what happens after d6, exploiting the pain of the e5 pawn, because the bishop is attacking the queen. Okay, we take, and after pawn takes back, now bishop to g5 is the key move. And obviously the pawn cannot take in e5, because the queen will just take the queen, and we're up a rook basically, because the bishop will take back. You might argue that, let's say rook takes back and the bishop takes, pawn to e4 attacks the knight with the discovered attack on the bishop of this diagonal, but you still also have another knight over here, and you're up material. The best move by black in this position is queen to c7. White now continues with the thematic queen h4. This stops black from potentially playing h6, because you're just going to win a pawn. Position is far superior for white now. This is not a free pawn, by the way, one last mention, because now knight to e4 is positionally a nightmare for black to play this game, because you've got idea on knight f6, and f5 doesn't help because you can still play knight f6 anyway. The threat is just too strong. You got pressure on h7, so if the bishop takes and bishop takes, you're going to win the pawn in e5. And even if black pushes it, bishop e5 is still the best move. It's a nightmare. Black can't really push, I don't know, queen d7. You can still attack it with the rooks. You're developing all of your pieces. Positions evaluated as if white was up almost 2 pieces. Yeah, the queen might go somewhere like f7. But look, the pressure is just going to be too much. Now white just plays knight to g5. Still putting pressure on h7. The queen will have to move again. And after bishop c3 targeting the knight. This knight can't even be defended. The queen can't move away to defend the knight, because he will leave h7 unguarded. It's a nightmare. So let's just go on to the next line. Let's do it like this from a recap, so we help ourselves memorize the patterns more. g6, castle, and after bishop g7, we take the knight to stop knight e5 from coming. Will be very annoying. Then there will be no point in playing the Rossolimo. So b takes, rook e1. So after the early development of the knight, e5, knight to d5, c4, knight to b6, d4. So we're looking at the proper move, right? C takes. Okay, we attack the knight again. And now earlier we went to knight c4. We explained all the positional problems that arise with that. Let's look at knight to d5. Okay, now we recapture the pawn in d4. We really never worry about this bishop pinning up this pawn in e5 with the diagonal of the queen. We're even going to play moves like b3, bishop to b2. I'd feel maybe under pressure if I didn't know how this opening works, because it would be scary. It is scary to have a bishop attacking this entire diagonal, queen, rook, all of these pieces on the target of the bishop, but it's actually okay. Let's see. Now black goes on with castling and on the thematic bishop g5. It's always good to play bishop g5 in such type of positions when you have good control of the squares d6 and f6 with your e5 pawn, because basically this now makes the control of these dark squares even stronger. Pins the e7 pawn, that also has to be said. And the funny thing is it cannot be kicked out. h6, now white plays the stunning queen to h4. The idea is of course to win a free pawn. And if black were to play h6, then these two pieces here will be too strong. And black king is completely unsafe for the rest of the game. White's idea will be to play something like knight c3 and swap with this knight. After that, e7 becomes the target. So let's make an example. Well, knight c3, of course, is the best move here. The idea is also just take the knight, get more attack on e7, and also double up the opponent pawn. Obviously, we're not going to look at knight takes because then you have an attack straight away on e7. So let's look at this move. You're probably wondering, what about this move? Doesn't this nullify the whole attack and gives black the possibility to continue towards the end game and not being crushed completely? Yes, but white has an advantage, massive advantage, because white simply takes. And taking back with the knight just doesn't help because queen c4 check, and after e6 blocking, either way knight e4 is coming, whatever black had done, you're gonna have a lot of pressure on the knight in f6. The knight is also potentially going to d6, position is evaluated around plus 450. If it was white to move again now, there will be a positional move, queen to c2. The idea, of course, is to take the knight. Black, in order to not lose material, will have to take back with the bishop, but then you'd have queen g6, completely winning. In this position, what happens after pawn takes? Finally, there's no more pin here. Well, there is a pin. The pawn in f6 is pinned, but it's also attacking the bishop. It's forcing us to move away. Black can start breathing with the rook, but still, positionally speaking, it's game over. White now goes on with bishop to d2 and is threatening to play knight takes, or even if you prefer, queen c4 first, and you're gonna double up and isolate this d pawn. White's development of the rooks it's easier. And after playing knight e5, then you're gonna play bishop to c2. So let's see what happens. Knight takes, bishop takes, for example, in order to keep the pawn structure safe. This doesn't help anyway. Black's king side is ruined. White has a plan of playing queen to g3, going for the pawn in g6, and also preparing knight to h4 in case black will play king to h7. Position evaluated as if white was up 2 pieces. So this is an extremely pleasant position to play. White's completely winning. You should be able to go to win a very easy endgame. A move like d5, trying to produce a passed pawn or induce a swap of pawns and try to be able to develop this bishop, this queen maybe. Still, you just take en passant, and after queen takes back, bishop to b4 will end the game, so black can't really play that. c5 attacking the bishop doesn't work because of queen c4. White wins a crucial pawn and goes for a very easy endgame where he's going to be able to place the rooks on the 7th rank before the opponent could. So let's start again and let's look at another move this time. Different variation, bishop b5 and g6, castle, bishop g7, we have to take the knight, b takes, and now rook e1. So after the early knight f6, which is what we're looking at in this video, but we will look at everything. e5, knight moves, c4, we've been going through knight b6, what happens after knight f4? Okay, white goes on with d4, and this discovers an attack on the knight, and also an attack on the pawn in c5. So white's about to get very similar positional advantages before. Remember, in this variation, you really love to have a pawn in c5 like this, right? This is just much better for white. Black will have to save the knight, so what's going to happen now? Knight to e6 protects the pawn in c5, is the only move that seems to be making sense, but it's already too late because d5 and the knight will have to move, and white is about to win a free pawn for nothing. If black doesn't want to lose material, let's say pawn takes, and then knight d4, there is no way out because knight takes, pawn takes, and then queen takes. It was unavoidable. So this is a bad line for the black player. What happens after d6 though? Putting pressure on e5. White goes on with the thematic bishop f4. We've seen something like this, similar to this, in one of the previous lines. After castling and knight to c3, white needs to rush development. Rook to b8, putting pressure on this, is met by queen to d2. There is enough defense over e5 and the queen is defending b2. After black's best move, which is bishop to f5, developing h3, idea of playing g4 potentially later on, not necessarily straight away. And after queen to b6, putting more pressure over b2, and developing the queen, and it looks like the black player in this specific line might be able to actually develop and play a normal game instead of getting completely crushed as in the previous examples. White goes on though with g4, immediately asking a question to the bishop. Bishop is forced to go, let's say, d7, also to give black the possibility to develop the other rook as well. Bishop c8 will be silly, but even then it doesn't change much. Take the pawn. It was good that we unpinned the pawn in e5 by moving the queen to d2. After pawn takes back though, the game is just positionally over. Rook e7, attacking the bishop. So black can't really take the pawn. I mean, yeah, black should take that pawn because there's nothing else. Let's say, for example, rook f to d8, protecting the bishop. Well, bishop e8 is kind of silly. White will keep improving its position. So let's say, for example, rook c1 will be the best move now. Taking the pawn in b2 is fine because after the swaps, we'll be able to play knight e4, going for a crucial attack on the damaged, the isolated pawn of our opponent, and make our d pawn the pass pawn. It's usually an asset in this type of game. If instead, let's say, black defends the bishop, this is a blunder because rook a to e1 was positional blunder. But position is evaluated +4. Bishop h6 is coming. Black can't move anything. If black takes this pawn, for instance, in this position, this loses because you'll simply take, and now taking d7. You're up a piece. Of course, the bishop can't take in c3 because rook takes rook with check. And if rook takes rook first, then rook check. Only move is to block with bishop f8. But then bishop h6. Checkmate to follow very soon. One more recap. So after knight c6 and we attack the knight, g6, castle, bishop g7, we take the knight, and we're looking at the b variation, b takes c6, and now rook e1, knight f6, we attack the knight immediately, knight to d5, we attack the knight again. What happens after knight to b4? We haven't looked at this. We also would need to look at knight c7 next time. So knight b4, white plays the thematic d4, and after pawn takes, we don't recapture, we attack the knight once again. Of course, we needed to play d4 for very obvious reason that the knight was attacking d3. So basically, if you play a3 now, knight d3 is very strong, and it's actually just better for black. So d4 pawn takes a3. Now the knight will have to go. Knight to a6 is the only move, right? No other square is accessible. All of them are attacked by white pieces. So knight a6, and now we recapture with the knight. And after castle, and knight to c3, what's going on here? What's going on is that black is once again in the same trouble as before. This pawn in e5 is glorious. The knight can't really go anywhere that makes sense. Even knight c7 just doesn't have access to any good square. And black will have to anyway move the knight many times to actually get it to go somewhere else, but then it will be ignoring the rest of the development. So let's look at this move, which we haven't looked at yet, this type of ideas. Bishop to b7. What happens if black tries to develop the bishop like that? You don't want to do it in these type of games. Black now goes on with bishop g5. You'll see why in a moment. The thing is that the only way for this bishop to become active is to play c5, which doesn't really look like a bad move anyway. However, this gives now the white player the possibility to play knight b5 and have more attack over c7 and d6, meaning that d6 will just never push. Knight c7 is not possible because you can take queen takes and then bishop e7. The rook will have to move, you can place the bishop in d6, you're completely winning. So let's look at h6 attacking the bishop. What happens now? Bishop to e3. So it looks like now knight c7 is actually possible. Black will finally want to play a6, kicking out our knight, which by the way doesn't really have anywhere to go, and then maybe start breathing. Knight c5 though is not possible right now because white's best move will be bishop takes c5. So for example, bishop takes, knight takes, you take back with the pawn. Obviously, if you take back with the knight, you deprive yourself of the possibility to simply advance your pawn further towards the opponent's side, and also give you a possibility to play rook c1 and have a rook developed on an open file. Rook c8 is now not possible because you can take the pawn for free in a7. So after a6, looking for a swap, best move is of course rook c1. We don't want to swap because if they take, then we can actually improve our position massively. And after rook to c8, now attacking the bishop, we take the pawn in a7. Taking the bishop is wrong because you can take the one in b7 with some scary consequences. Let's say for example rook takes, pawn takes, and then rook to c7. We haven't really lost the pawn because you can play queen to f3, and after queen to b8, it looks like you are going to lose the pawn, but then knight to d5 with an attack on the rook. The rook can take. Yes, we have indeed lost our pawn, but after knight e7 check, we still have 2 pawns advantage. We might just play b4. We're going to have to carry on the game from here. We're going to end the line here. White is completely winning, massive advantage, and yeah, these 2 passed pawns should do the job. In this position, even if black had chosen to take the pawn in a6 with the bishop. Still, knight d5 will be the best move. And yeah, again, we have the same pattern. We have these two passed pawns. We have an attack on e7. And even if rook e8 stopping that, rook c3 will be the best move by white. The idea, of course, is to play bishop to b6, winning the game, because the queen can't go anywhere, it's completely trapped. And the rook, if we had left the rook in c1, then rook could have taken our rook in c1 after bishop b6 with an attack on our queen. But now that we have it here, even if rook were to take our rook, we can ignore it and win material